The black Cadillac Escalade rolled through the iron gates of the waterfront estate, just as the evening sun began sinking behind Seattle's skyline. From a distance, the mansion looked like something out of a magazine. 3 stories of glass, stone, and steel perched above Elliott Bay, with private gardens stretching toward the water. To most people, it represented success at the highest level. To Ethan Carter, it represented something much simpler. It was supposed to be a home. At 42 years old, Ethan had become one of the most respected entrepreneurs in America. His software company had transformed from a small startup, operating out of a rented garage, into a corporation valued at several $billions. Business magazines called him a visionary. Investors called him a genius. Young entrepreneurs called him an inspiration. But none of those titles meant much to him whenever he thought about the woman waiting inside, Grace Johnson. The woman who had raised him. Officially, Grace was not his biological mother. The state records described her as a foster parent who had taken responsibility for a troubled 9-year-old boy after multiple placements had failed. But Ethan had never cared about official records. Grace Johnson was the only mother he had ever known. After spending nearly 3 weeks traveling between Boston, Chicago, and New York for a major acquisition deal, Ethan had decided to return home early without telling anyone. He imagined Grace's reaction when she saw him walk through the door unexpectedly. She always worried when he traveled too much. No matter how successful he became, she still treated him like the skinny little boy who used to come home from school carrying broken electronics he hoped to repair. A smile crossed his face as he picked up the small gift bag resting on the passenger seat. Inside was a handcrafted silver bracelet he had purchased from a local artist during his trip. It wasn't expensive compared to the things he could afford now, but Grace never cared about price tags. She appreciated thoughtfulness more than luxury. If you're still watching this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Stories like this remind us that true family isn't always connected by blood. It's connected by sacrifice, loyalty, and love. Now let's begin. As he entered through the side door that connected directly to the kitchen, he expected to smell fresh coffee or hear music playing softly in the background. Instead, he heard shouting. The sound stopped him instantly. At first, he couldn't make out the words. Then another voice answered, quieter and trembling. His smile disappeared. He recognized both voices immediately. One belonged to his wife, Vanessa. The other belonged to Grace. Ethan took another step forward and instinctively stopped beside a marble column near the entrance. Something about the conversation felt wrong. "You really don't understand boundaries, do you?" Vanessa said sharply. There was a pause before Grace answered. "I'm sorry." "I didn't think anyone would mind." Vanessa laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you didn't think, that's the problem." Ethan frowned. The tone in Vanessa's voice wasn't frustration. It was contempt. "I was only trying to help," Grace said softly. "No," Vanessa replied. "You were trying to make people think you're part of this family. My friends were asking questions. Do you know how awkward it is when they walk into the dining room and find you sitting there acting like you belong?" Grace remained silent. Vanessa apparently interpreted the silence as permission to continue. "You should remember where you came from. Ethan may feel obligated to take care of you, but that doesn't make you his mother." The words hung in the air, cold, cruel. Ethan's grip tightened around the gift bag. Vanessa had always appeared affectionate toward Grace whenever he was present. She bought her birthday gifts. She posted family photos online. She referred to her as Mom in front of guests. Now hidden from view, she sounded like a completely different person. "I never asked him for anything," Grace finally said. "Really?" Vanessa shot back. "Then why are you living in a $30 million house? Why are all your expenses paid?" Grace's voice grew even quieter. "I love him, that's all." "Love," she scoffed. "You took care of a foster child. Congratulations, thousands of people do that." Ethan closed his eyes. She had no idea what Grace had sacrificed. No idea how many nights she had gone without sleep. No idea how many opportunities she had given up so that one frightened little boy could have a future. A memory surfaced in his mind. He was 11 years old, sitting in a small apartment in Detroit during one of the coldest winters the city had experienced in years. Grace had just finished a 14-hour shift at a nursing facility. Yet somehow she arrived home carrying a second-hand computer she had purchased from a pawn shop. "How did you afford this?" he had asked. Grace smiled and changed the subject. Years later, he discovered she had sold her wedding ring to buy it. She never told him. She simply wanted him to have a chance. Back in the present, Ethan heard something that completely shattered him. "You should be grateful I even allow you to stay here," Vanessa said. The word echoed through his mind. Allow? This house existed because of Grace. Everything Ethan had built could be traced back to sacrifices she had made decades earlier. Yet somehow Vanessa believed she had the authority to decide whether Grace belonged there. And then Ethan finally looked around the corner. What he saw stole the air from his lungs. Grace was wearing a housekeeping uniform, not casual clothes. A uniform. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared. The woman who had worked herself to exhaustion so he could build a future was standing in his kitchen dressed like hired staff. And judging by the sadness in her eyes, this wasn't the first time. It was routine. Something had been happening inside his home while he was traveling across the country. Something that had gone on far longer than he realized. At that moment, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to confront Vanessa immediately, because Grace had taught him something important many years ago. People reveal their true nature when they believe nobody is watching. And for the first time, Ethan intended to watch everything. Years of building a billion-dollar company had taught him one lesson that applied just as well to life as it did to business. The first person to react usually loses. The person who gathers facts wins. Quietly, he backed away and made his way upstairs to his private office overlooking Elliott Bay. The moment the door closed behind him, he opened the security system connected to the mansion. Years earlier, after several high-profile break-ins across Seattle, Ethan had upgraded the property with a state-of-the-art surveillance network. Cameras covered every common area of the estate except private bedrooms and bathrooms. He rarely checked them. As the first recording loaded onto the screen, Ethan told himself there was probably an explanation. Maybe this had been a single bad moment. Within 10 minutes, that hope disappeared. The first video showed Grace preparing breakfast alone in the kitchen, a quiet morning from nearly a month earlier. She moved slowly, carefully measuring ingredients while humming a church hymn Ethan remembered from childhood. A few moments later, Vanessa entered. Without saying good morning, she opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and immediately began criticizing everything Grace was doing. The tone wasn't loud. In some ways, that made it worse. It was the tone of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Grace apologized twice despite having done nothing wrong. Ethan opened another recording. Then another. What he discovered wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern. Every time Ethan traveled, Vanessa seemed to transform into someone else. One recording showed Grace sitting alone on the patio reading a novel. Vanessa walked outside, glanced at her, and said, "You know, sometimes I wonder why Ethan never moved on." Grace looked confused. "What do you mean?" Vanessa shrugged. "Most successful people eventually leave their past behind." Grace lowered her eyes and returned to her book. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it revealed everything. Vanessa wasn't merely insulting Grace. She was trying to convince her that she didn't belong, trying to erase her place in Ethan's life. As the hours passed, Ethan continued reviewing footage. He saw meals eaten alone, he saw Grace excluded from family events, and yet through it all, Grace never complained, not once. The realization hurt more than the cruelty itself, because Ethan knew exactly why she stayed silent. Grace had spent her entire life protecting other people. Even now, she was protecting him. Protecting his marriage, protecting his peace of mind. Late that evening, Ethan found a recording that forced him to stop. The date stamp showed it had happened 3 weeks earlier, the day before his birthday. Grace had spent hours decorating the dining room, nothing extravagant. Just flowers, candles, and photographs collected throughout Ethan's life. Pictures from elementary school, from college, from the early days of his company. A mother had created it. Not because she wanted attention, because she was proud of her son. Then Vanessa arrived. At first she looked annoyed, then angry. Without hesitation, she began removing the photographs, throwing them into a box. Grace tried to explain, tried to tell her Ethan would enjoy seeing them. Vanessa ignored her completely. Within minutes, everything was gone. Grace remained standing there in silence, not arguing, just watching. Ethan leaned back in his chair and covered his face with his hands. For the first time that day, he felt tears forming in his eyes, not because of what Vanessa had done, because of what Grace had endured for months alone. He stood and walked to the window. Below, the lights of Seattle reflected across the dark water. The view usually calmed him. Tonight, it did nothing, because another question had begun forming in his mind. If Vanessa behaved this way when she thought nobody was watching, what else had she been hiding? Near midnight, while searching through archived security files, Ethan noticed something unusual. Several recordings showed Vanessa constantly using her phone whenever she interacted with Grace. Texting, taking pictures, sending messages. Then Ethan remembered. Years earlier, his cybersecurity team had developed software capable of recovering deleted communications from company devices. The technology was perfectly legal when used on property registered under the account holder's name. And Vanessa's phone plan was part of a family account registered under Ethan's name. The following morning, Ethan came downstairs pretending everything was normal. Vanessa greeted him with surprise and excitement. "Ethan, you're home early," he smiled politely. Years ago, she would have noticed something was wrong. Now she was too confident, too certain that her secrets were safe. "I wanted to surprise everyone," he replied. Grace entered the room carrying a coffee tray. The moment she saw him, her entire face lit up. For a second, the sadness disappeared. All Ethan could see was the woman who had spent decades loving him unconditionally, and his decision became even stronger. Whatever this situation turned out to be, however ugly the truth became, he would fix it. Not because he was a billionaire, but because some debts can never be repaid. And the woman standing in front of him had earned a lifetime of loyalty. That morning, Ethan drove downtown for what appeared to be a routine business meeting. In reality, he was heading somewhere very different, a discreet office building near Pioneer Square. Waiting inside was a man named Daniel Brooks, former federal investigator, current digital forensic specialist, one of the best in the country. When Ethan finished explaining the situation, Daniel sat silently for several moments. "This isn't just family conflict," he said finally. "No, it sounds organized." Daniel nodded slowly. "The behavior you're describing isn't random. People don't usually become this comfortable mistreating someone overnight. Patterns like this develop over time, and sometimes they're reinforced by other people who share the same beliefs." Before leaving, Ethan gave Daniel access to several files and account records connected to the family phone plan. The forensic review would take a few days. That very evening, another piece of the puzzle revealed itself. It happened during a charity fundraiser hosted at a luxury hotel overlooking Lake Washington. Vanessa had insisted they attend. This time, Ethan agreed immediately. Something told him he needed to go. As they entered the ballroom, Vanessa seemed unusually excited. She greeted several women with warm hugs and bright smiles, wives of executives, investors, real estate developers. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Ethan noticed something. Whenever Grace's name came up in conversation, subtle expressions appeared. Small smiles, suppressed amusement, the kind people exchange when sharing a private joke. Vanessa wasn't acting alone. Later that evening, while Vanessa mingled across the ballroom, Ethan stepped onto a balcony overlooking the water. His phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. "Call me immediately." Ethan answered at once. "What did you find?" For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. Then he exhaled heavily. "What I'm about to tell you is much bigger than I expected." "How big?" "Big enough that you may want legal counsel involved before we proceed." The city lights reflected across the dark water below. "We recovered thousands of deleted messages," Daniel continued, "and Vanessa wasn't just discussing Grace." He paused. "She was part of a private group involving several wealthy women from Seattle." "What kind of group?" "The kind that shares strategies." "Strategies for what?" Then came the answer. "Getting rid of inconvenient family members." For a moment, Ethan thought he had misheard. "The conversations go back almost 3 years," Daniel continued. "Elderly parents, step-parents, foster relatives, in-laws, anyone they considered embarrassing, inconvenient, or socially undesirable." Ethan stared across the water. His grip tightened around the phone. "Tell me you're joking." I wish I was. What you're dealing with isn't simply bullying. Some of these messages discuss manipulation, emotional abuse, false medical reports, and attempts to pressure relatives into assisted living facilities against their wishes. A terrible possibility formed in Ethan's mind. Grace, yes, the answer came immediately. Your wife discussed Grace extensively. What exactly did she say? Daniel lowered his voice carefully. She repeatedly described Grace as a social liability. She complained that people asked questions about why a black foster mother lived in your home. There are dozens of messages. Some are worse. Ethan asked the question he feared most. Was she planning something? Yes. That single word changed everything. Suddenly all the strange incidents made sense. The pressure, the isolation, the humiliation. None of it had been random. It had been preparation step by step. Vanessa had been building a narrative, a story where Grace appeared confused, dependent, unable to care for herself, a story designed to justify removing her permanently. We also found communications with a lawyer, Daniel added. Ethan's jaw tightened. What kind? Guardianship discussions. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Music still played inside the ballroom. Guests continued laughing and drinking champagne. And somewhere in that noise, Ethan finally understood the full truth. Vanessa wasn't merely trying to make Grace uncomfortable. She intended to remove her completely, legally. And if Ethan hadn't returned home early, she might have succeeded. Across the ballroom, Vanessa laughed with her friends, completely unaware that the foundation beneath her carefully constructed life had just begun to crack. For the rest of the evening, Ethan remained at the fundraiser, but his attention was fixed entirely on one thing: the people surrounding Vanessa. He noticed Rebecca Langford, wife of a prominent investment executive; Diane Keller, whose family owned one of the largest commercial real estate companies in Washington state. And then Margaret Holloway. Unlike the others, Margaret rarely spoke, but when she did, people listened. Even Vanessa seemed careful around her. Margaret came from old money, the kind that existed long before technology companies transformed Seattle. Her family name appeared on hospitals, museums, and university buildings. To the public, she was a generous philanthropist. To the city's elite, she was something even more powerful: a gatekeeper, someone capable of opening doors or closing them forever. As Ethan watched the group interact, a thought crystallized. If Vanessa was part of a larger network, someone had encouraged her. Someone had validated her behavior. And that person might be Margaret. During the drive home, Vanessa spent most of the time discussing the fundraiser, who attended, who donated, which families were gaining influence. Every observation centered around status, social rank, appearance, approval. The entire conversation sounded less like a discussion about people and more like a discussion about a hierarchy, a system. And in that system, Grace had never been accepted, not because of anything she had done, but because of where she came from. Hours later, long after Vanessa had fallen asleep, Ethan sat alone in his office reviewing old photographs. Thousands of images from family albums scanned over the years. Grace standing beside his middle school science project, Grace cheering at his high school graduation, Grace crying when he launched his first company, Grace hugging him after his first major business success. Every milestone, every breakthrough, she had been there. Not once had she asked for recognition. She simply loved him. And suddenly Ethan understood something. Vanessa hadn't merely insulted Grace. She had insulted the very foundation of his entire life. The next morning, Ethan invited Grace out for breakfast. Just the two of them. When he suggested it, Grace seemed surprised. Breakfast on a Tuesday? Ethan laughed. Last time I checked, Tuesday was still allowed. A few hours later, they were sitting inside a quiet waterfront cafe overlooking Puget Sound, a place that held special memories. Years earlier, before Ethan became famous, they had visited it to celebrate small victories. Back then, one shared dessert had felt like luxury. For a while, they talked about simple things: the weather, books, old neighbors from Detroit, children Grace had recently met through volunteer programs. Eventually, the conversation turned serious. You look tired, baby, Grace said softly. I'm fine. Grace studied him, then she shook her head. No, you've always been a terrible liar. Ethan laughed quietly. That much was true. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his. What's bothering you? For a moment, Ethan considered telling her everything: the videos, the messages, the investigation. Instead, he asked a different question, one that had been haunting him since returning home. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace's expression changed immediately. She knew exactly what he meant. For several seconds she looked out toward the water. Then she sighed. "Because I know you. You've spent your whole life carrying responsibility for everyone around you. When you were 12, you worried about paying bills. When you were 16, you worried about helping me retire. When you were 22, you worried about every employee in your company." She squeezed his hand. "I didn't want you worrying about me too." The answer hurt more than any accusation could have. Because it sounded exactly like something Grace would say, Ethan looked down at the table. "Nobody should have to endure what you've endured." Grace stayed silent. And that silence told him everything. People don't stay silent when accusations are false. They stay silent when the truth is too painful to discuss. For the first time, Ethan felt a sharp stab of guilt. How many months had Grace suffered while he was busy chasing success? And as he drove back toward the city, another realization formed. This wasn't only about exposing Vanessa anymore. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring something that had been taken from Grace: her dignity, her peace. That afternoon, Daniel was already waiting when Ethan reached his office, and what he revealed went far deeper than before. The investigation had uncovered not just Vanessa's private conversations, but a structured network of influential women connected through charity boards and private social circles, all linked through encrypted platforms and deleted messages that had only recently been recovered. The pattern was impossible to misunderstand. This was no longer about personal dislike. It was a shared way of thinking among several powerful families who viewed elderly relatives, foster parents, and socially inconvenient individuals not as human beings, but as problems to be managed, controlled, or quietly removed. Daniel explained that Vanessa's conversations were detailed, describing methods of emotional isolation, false behavioral documentation, and coordinated discussions with legal advisors about guardianship applications that could legally transfer control of a person's life without their consent. And then came the final detail. Vanessa had not only discussed Grace, she had actively contributed to a narrative claiming Grace was becoming mentally unstable. A narrative being built piece by piece to justify future legal action that would permanently remove her from Ethan's life, under the label of protection and care. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He finally understood the full shape of what had been happening inside his home, while he was building companies and closing deals. Every moment he had assumed was normal family life had been part of something carefully constructed. Something cold and completely focused formed inside him, not anger in the usual sense. Clarity. The kind that appears when a person finally understands they are no longer dealing with misunderstanding, but with intention. Later that evening, Daniel confirmed one final layer. Several members of the same social circle had previously been involved in similar cases. Elderly individuals or foster guardians legally removed through guardianship pressure, financial isolation, or coordinated reputational damage. None of those cases had ever reached public attention, but the patterns were unmistakable. What Ethan was dealing with was not one person's cruelty. It was a shared method of control that had operated quietly for years, because no one had ever been powerful enough to expose it. That evening, Ethan visited Grace. When he arrived, she was sitting near the window as usual, reading under warm light. For a moment she looked peaceful, and that image made everything inside Ethan tighten, because he now knew how much effort it had taken for her to appear peaceful at all. They talked for a long time. Simple things, memories, ordinary details that had always held their relationship together. Then, in one of those quiet moments, Grace said something softly, almost as if she had been holding it back for too long. "Sometimes the house feels different when you're not around. Not because of anything obvious, just the way people look at me when they think I don't notice." Ethan did not interrupt, he simply listened. And in that silence, something inside him became completely certain. The time for waiting was over. Ethan made a decision. Instead of confronting Vanessa immediately, he began preparing something far more controlled, far more precise, and far more permanent than any emotional reaction could be. He invited Vanessa to attend a major charity gala scheduled later that week, hosted by one of Seattle's most influential philanthropic organizations, where business leaders, media representatives, and high-profile families would all gather in one place. Vanessa accepted immediately. Over the next few days, Ethan allowed everything at home to appear completely normal. He continued conversations, attended meetings, and responded to Vanessa with the same calmness as before. But internally, he was no longer living inside the same reality. Every hour had a purpose. Every interaction was being observed. The night of the charity gala arrived with all the elegance that high society events carry. Crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors. Soft classical music floating through the hall. Wealthy guests arriving with smiles that often hid more than they revealed. Ethan Carter walked through the entrance knowing that tonight would not end like any previous night in his life. Vanessa stood beside him looking flawless, greeting people with practiced warmth, moving effortlessly through conversations as if she had nothing to hide. What she did not know was that Ethan was no longer observing her as a husband, but as someone who had already seen the truth behind every expression she wore. As the event progressed and the hall filled with guests, Vanessa became more confident, believing she was surrounded by allies and friends, unaware that many of those relationships had already been exposed through investigations unfolding quietly for days. When the moment arrived for the main presentation, Ethan stepped forward to the stage with calm composure. For a brief moment, the room assumed he was about to deliver a standard speech about donations and community work. Instead, he placed his hand on the podium and looked across the audience in complete silence. The room gradually quieted, and then Ethan spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He began by talking about family, trust, and the unseen sacrifices that build the foundation of success. As he spoke, people listened more carefully because something in his voice carried a weight different from a typical public address. Then, without warning, the large screen behind him turned on. At first, guests assumed it was part of the presentation, but within seconds, confusion replaced curiosity. Security footage began to play, scenes from inside Ethan's own home, Grace sitting alone. Grace being spoken to harshly, meals eaten in silence, a birthday decoration being destroyed without a word of explanation. The audience shifted uncomfortably, whispers spreading through the hall as people tried to understand what they were watching. Vanessa's expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief to something far more dangerous, recognition, because she knew exactly what was being shown. Ethan continued speaking in a steady voice, stating facts, dates, and evidence collected over months, each word reinforcing what the footage already made impossible to deny. The guests slowly realized they were not watching a presentation. They were watching an exposure. Then came the second layer, private messages, deleted conversations. Names of women in the room who had participated in the same network. Legal consultations. Fabricated narratives designed to destroy an innocent woman's credibility. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Several guests quietly set down their glasses. One woman near the back stood and left without a word. Vanessa remained frozen in place, and when it was over there was no applause, no comfortable return to dinner conversation. Only the sound of a truth that had finally refused to stay hidden, and the understanding that some secrets once exposed in the right room cannot be buried again. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived, not with noise but with the quiet, inevitable weight of truth being acknowledged. Legal counsel became involved. Investigations were opened. Several families whose names had appeared in those messages began the slow, painful process of public reckoning. And through all of it, Ethan focused on one thing alone: Grace. He removed every reminder of her hidden suffering from the house. He restored her place at the table, not symbolically, but in every practical and personal way that mattered. He made certain she would never again spend a single day feeling like a guest in a home she had helped make possible. And as he watched Grace finally breathe freely again, free from the silent weight she had carried for so long, Ethan realized something that stayed with him more than the exposure, more than the downfall of those who had tried to break her spirit. In the end, it was never about destroying anyone. It was about protecting the one person who had built everything from nothing and never once asked for credit in return. Because some people don't just raise children, they build entire futures with their sacrifices, and those sacrifices deserve to be protected no matter what it costs. If someone you trusted was secretly hurting the person who raised you, would you quietly gather evidence like Ethan, or confront them the moment you found out? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe that family, respect, and justice should always come before power and status, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes in standing up for the people who sacrificed everything for us. Because here on this channel, we don't just tell stories. We tell stories where justice always finds its way back.